My name is Margaret Thompson, and at 54 years old, I never imagined I would be standing outside the front gate of my own home with nothing but a small suitcase in my hands. 3 months had passed since my beloved husband Robert died of a sudden heart attack, and my son David had just thrown me out like yesterday's garbage. The crisp autumn air cut through my thin coat as I watched David lock the door behind him, his cold eyes showing no trace of the little boy I had raised and loved for 28 years. He claimed the house belonged to him now according to some new will I had never seen before. As I stood there shivering and homeless, I reached into my purse and felt the worn edges of Robert's old bank card that I had kept as a memento. Before we dive into this incredible journey of betrayal and justice, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story resonates with you, please hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories that will absolutely blow your mind. Trust me, what happens next will completely change everything you think you know about hidden family secrets. Now, let's see what that old bank card was about to reveal. 25 years of marriage to Robert had been the happiest time of my life. He was a gentle construction contractor who always told me not to worry about money matters, saying he would handle everything. Robert had a way of making me feel secure and protected, always assuring me that our future was bright even though we lived modestly in our 3-bedroom house in suburban Cleveland. He worked long hours building homes for other families while making sure our own family had everything we needed. David grew up spoiled and entitled, always getting the latest video games, expensive clothes, and a brand new car for his 16th birthday. Robert and I wanted to give him the childhood we never had, but somewhere along the way, David became selfish and demanding. After graduating college with a business degree that Robert paid for entirely, David moved back home and barely worked, spending his days playing video games and going out with friends while his father continued to support him financially. The funeral 3 months ago was a blur of tears, flowers, and condolences from neighbors and Robert's coworkers. I was drowning in grief, barely able to function as I tried to process the sudden loss of my life partner. David seemed oddly composed during the service, shaking hands with visitors and accepting their sympathy with a strange calmness that unsettled me. 2 weeks after we buried Robert, David's entire demeanor toward me changed like someone had flipped a switch. He became cold, distant, and spoke to me with a tone I had never heard before. The loving son who used to hug me goodnight became a stranger who barely acknowledged my presence in our own home. Then came the day that shattered my world completely. I was sitting in the kitchen having my morning coffee when David walked in with a man in an expensive suit carrying a leather briefcase. This was Bradley Coleman, a lawyer I had never met before in my life. Bradley opened his briefcase and pulled out documents that he claimed were Robert's final will and testament. According to this supposed will, Robert had left the house, all bank accounts, and every possession to David alone. I was mentioned only as someone who could remain in the house if I agreed to help with household chores and cooking. The shock hit me like a physical blow, making my hands shake as I tried to read the legal documents that made no sense to me. I told them this had to be some kind of mistake because Robert and I had made our wills together 5 years earlier with our family lawyer, Harold Greenfield, and everything was supposed to go to me first, then to David. Bradley Coleman looked at me with cold eyes and said that Robert had changed his will 6 months before his death, apparently deciding that David was more responsible with money and property. The man I had loved and trusted for 25 years had supposedly decided I was incapable of managing our life together. David sat there with his arms crossed, nodding along as if this revelation was perfectly reasonable. When I asked to call Harold Greenfield, David told me that wouldn't be necessary because Bradley Coleman was now our family lawyer. My grief turned to confusion and then to anger as I realized what was happening. I refused to accept these terms, telling David that I was his mother and this house was my home too. David's response chilled me to the bone. He stood up slowly, looked me directly in the eyes, and said, "Mother, you have 2 choices. You can stay here as my employee and follow my rules, or you can leave. Those are your only options." When I asked him how he could treat his own mother this way, especially so soon after losing his father, David just shrugged and said that Robert had made his decision clear. I spent that night lying awake in my bedroom, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand how my life had fallen apart so completely. The next morning, David brought in 2 security guards and told them to escort me off the property if I caused any trouble. Mrs. Henderson from next door watched through her window as I packed my belongings, her face showing sympathy but not offering any help. I knew she was scared to get involved, and I couldn't blame her for that. As I dragged my suitcase down the front walkway, David called out from the doorway, "When you're ready to accept reality, you know where to find me." That was the last thing my son said to me as I became homeless at 54 years old. I spent that first night at the Sunset Motel, a rundown place on the edge of town where the sheets smelled like cigarettes and the air conditioning unit rattled all night long. I had exactly $347 in my checking account and no idea how I was going to survive. As I sat on the lumpy mattress surrounded by everything I owned, I remembered Robert's old bank card that I had been carrying in my wallet since his death. I had kept it as a sentimental reminder of him, never thinking to use it because I assumed the account would be closed. Looking at that worn piece of plastic, I decided that tomorrow I would go to the bank and see if there might be enough money left to help me get back on my feet somehow. The next morning I walked into First National Bank wearing my best dress, trying to maintain some dignity despite feeling like my world was crumbling around me. The bank was busy with the usual morning rush of people making deposits and withdrawals, and I had to wait in line for 20 minutes before reaching a teller window. The young woman behind the counter was Jennifer Walsh, someone I had never met before who looked at me with barely concealed annoyance. Her name tag was perfectly polished and her makeup was flawless, making me feel even more self-conscious about my appearance after a sleepless night at the motel. When I handed her Robert's old bank card and asked to check the account balance, Jennifer rolled her eyes slightly and sighed as if I was wasting her valuable time. Jennifer took the card with obvious reluctance and swiped it through her computer system, expecting to tell me that the account was closed or empty. Instead, her expression changed completely as she stared at her computer screen with wide eyes. The color drained from her face and she looked back and forth between the screen and Robert's card several times, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. She stammered something about needing to get her manager and practically ran away from the teller window, leaving me standing there confused and worried that I had somehow done something wrong. Within minutes, a distinguished man in his 50s approached me with Jennifer trailing behind him looking nervous. This was Harrison Clark, the bank manager, who introduced himself with a firm handshake and guided me toward his private office. Harrison had silver hair and wore an expensive suit that spoke of years of experience in banking, but his composed demeanor couldn't hide the shock in his eyes. He asked me to have a seat in the leather chair across from his mahogany desk while Jennifer stood by the door looking like she had seen a ghost. Harrison picked up his phone and made a quick call, speaking in hushed tones about verifying account information and requesting additional security protocols. When Harrison hung up the phone and turned to face me, his hands were actually shaking slightly. He cleared his throat and said, "Mrs. Thompson, I need to confirm your identity and relationship to Robert Thompson before we can proceed." I showed him my driver's license and our marriage certificate that I always kept in my purse, documents that proved I had been Robert's wife for 25 years. Harrison examined these papers carefully, making photocopies and comparing signatures while I sat there wondering what could possibly be causing such a reaction. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife, and I could hear Jennifer whispering to someone outside the office door. Finally, Harrison looked up from the paperwork and spoke the words that changed everything. "Mrs. Thompson, the account balance is $33,247,892.76. I thought I had misheard him and asked him to repeat the number. When he said, $33 million, again, I felt like I was having some kind of hallucination. This couldn't possibly be real. My husband was a construction worker, not a millionaire. We lived paycheck to paycheck, clipping coupons and shopping at discount stores. There had to be some kind of terrible mistake. Harrison explained that this was a private investment account that Robert had opened 15 years earlier, making regular deposits and investments in real estate and blue-chip stocks. The account had grown steadily over the years through compound interest and smart investment choices, reaching its current massive value. Robert had been listed as the sole account holder, with no beneficiaries or co-signers mentioned in the bank's records. I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process the fact that my husband had hidden $33 million from me for 15 years. How could the man I loved and trusted keep such an enormous secret? Why would he let me worry about grocery bills and utility payments when we were actually wealthy beyond my wildest dreams? My initial shock gave way to anger and hurt as I realized the implications of this discovery. Robert had watched me stress over money countless times, had seen me work part-time jobs to help pay bills, had let me feel guilty about small purchases like a new dress or dinner at a restaurant. All while he was secretly building a fortune that could have made our lives so much easier and more comfortable. I asked Harrison why Robert had never told me about this money, but of course, the bank manager had no way of knowing my husband's motivations. The only thing Harrison could tell me was that Robert had been very specific about keeping this account private and confidential. When I asked to withdraw some money to help with my current situation, Harrison's expression became grave. He explained that as Robert's wife, I would normally inherit his assets, but without being named on the account or having proper legal documentation, the bank couldn't release any funds to me immediately. I would need to go through probate court and provide documentation proving my right to inherit Robert's estate. This could take months or even years, especially if someone contested my claim. Harrison recommended that I hire a probate attorney immediately to begin the legal process of accessing what was rightfully mine as Robert's widow. I left the bank that day with my head spinning and my heart broken in an entirely new way. Not only was I grieving the loss of my husband, but I was also dealing with the betrayal of learning about his massive secret. Even worse, I was technically a millionaire who couldn't access a single dollar of my own money while I lived in a cheap motel and watched my savings dwindle away. The irony was almost too much to bear, but I knew I had to fight for what belonged to me. Robert may have kept secrets, but I was his wife, and that money should be mine to use for building a new life without him. I spent that evening researching probate lawyers on the computer at the local library, calling every office I could find until I reached Amanda Rodriguez, an attorney who specialized in estate disputes and inheritance cases. Amanda had a reputation for being tough and thorough, with 15 years of experience fighting for clients who had been wrongfully denied their inheritance. When I explained my situation during our initial phone consultation, Amanda was immediately interested in taking my case. She said that David's sudden appearance with a new will right after Robert's death raised several red flags, especially since I had never been informed about any changes to our estate planning. Amanda's office was located in downtown Cleveland, in a glass building that spoke of success and competence. She was a sharp woman in her early 40s with dark hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything. During our first meeting, Amanda explained that we needed to investigate whether David's will was legitimate or if he had somehow forged or manipulated the document. She said that in her experience, sudden changes to wills right before someone's death often indicated fraud or coercion, especially when the changes excluded a long-term spouse completely. Amanda also pointed out that it was extremely unusual for Robert to create such a massive secret account without including me, given our 25-year marriage and the fact that we had always handled finances together. Our investigation began immediately, with Amanda hiring a private investigator named Thomas Baker to look into Bradley Coleman's background and examine the circumstances surrounding Robert's supposed will change. Within a week, Thomas discovered some disturbing information. Bradley Coleman had a history of questionable legal practices and had been sanctioned twice by the State Bar Association for ethical violations. Even more suspicious, Bradley had received a cash payment of $50,000 from David just 2 days after Robert's funeral, supposedly for legal services that should have cost no more than a few $1,000s. The breakthrough came when Amanda and I searched through Robert's personal papers more carefully and discovered a safe deposit box key hidden in his old toolbox in the garage. David had given me permission to retrieve some of Robert's personal belongings, not realizing that this key would unlock the truth about my husband's real intentions. The safe deposit box was located at a different bank across town, and when we opened it with a court order, we found Robert's actual will dated just 1 month before his death. This real will left everything to me, including the $33 million account, with David receiving the house only after my death. The document was properly witnessed and notarized, completely contradicting the fake will that David and Bradley had presented to me. Armed with this evidence, Amanda immediately filed legal papers challenging David's fraudulent will and requesting an emergency injunction to freeze all of Robert's assets until the matter could be resolved in court. We also filed criminal complaints against David and Bradley Coleman for forgery, fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft. I felt a mixture of vindication and heartbreak as I realized that my son had deliberately tried to steal my inheritance and leave me homeless and penniless. The little boy I had loved and raised had grown into someone willing to destroy his own mother's life for money. David's response was swift and vicious. Within days of our filing the legal papers, he hired a team of expensive lawyers led by a man named Charles Whitman, who had a reputation for using dirty tactics to win cases at any cost. David also hired a private investigator named Victor Sanchez, a former police officer with a questionable past who specialized in digging up dirt on people to discredit them. Victor began following me everywhere I went, taking photos and trying to find anything that could be used against me in court. I noticed his black sedan parked outside the motel where I was staying, and he made no effort to hide the fact that he was watching my every move. The harassment escalated when David began spreading rumors around our old neighborhood that I was suffering from mental illness and had been secretly abusive toward Robert during our marriage. He contacted several of my former co-workers and told them that I had been stealing money from Robert's construction business, which was completely false but damaging to my reputation. David even went so far as to contact Dr. Patricia Morgan, a psychiatrist who had never met me, and somehow convinced her to write a report suggesting that I was delusional and possibly dangerous. This report was obviously fake, but it showed how far David was willing to go to destroy my credibility. The situation became even more frightening when I started receiving anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night. The caller never spoke, but I could hear breathing on the other end of the line before they hung up. Someone also broke into my motel room one night while I was having dinner at a nearby restaurant, going through all my papers and belongings but not stealing anything valuable. It was clear that they were looking for information about my legal case or anything else they could use against me. The motel manager found the door jimmied open and recommended that I move to a different location for my own safety. Amanda strongly advised me to hire personal security protection, so I contacted Frank Miller, a retired police officer who ran a small security company. Frank was a solidly built man in his 50s with gray hair and kind eyes who had spent 20 years protecting people from various threats. He assured me that he had dealt with intimidation tactics like this before and knew how to keep me safe while we fought the legal battle. Frank's presence gave me some peace of mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that my own son was capable of almost anything to get what he wanted. The sweet child who used to crawl into my lap for bedtime stories had become someone I barely recognized, and that realization was almost as painful as losing Robert. 2 weeks into the legal battle, my sister Catherine suddenly appeared at my motel room door with tears in her eyes and a concerned expression that seemed completely genuine. Catherine lived in Chicago and we hadn't spoken much since Robert's funeral, so I was surprised to see her but grateful for what appeared to be family support during this difficult time. She was 3 years younger than me and had always been the more outgoing and socially successful sister, working as a marketing executive for a large company and living in an expensive downtown apartment. Catherine listened sympathetically as I told her everything about David's betrayal, the hidden money, and the legal fight I was facing against my own son. Catherine seemed genuinely shocked by David's behavior and offered to help me in any way she could. She said that families should stick together during times of crisis and that she couldn't believe David would treat his own mother so cruelly. Her support felt like a lifeline during one of the darkest periods of my life, and I found myself trusting her completely with details about my legal strategy and the evidence Amanda had uncovered. Catherine asked intelligent questions about the case and seemed to understand the complexities of the inheritance dispute better than I would have expected from someone without legal training. What I didn't realize was that Catherine had her own financial problems that she had been hiding from the family for months. Her marketing job was in jeopardy due to company downsizing, and she had been living beyond her means for years, accumulating credit card debt and struggling to maintain her expensive lifestyle. When David reached out to her with an offer of $50,000 in exchange for information about my legal strategy, Catherine saw it as a solution to her financial problems. She rationalized this betrayal by telling herself that David was going to win anyway and that I was fighting a hopeless battle against superior legal resources. Catherine convinced me to sign what she claimed was a temporary power of attorney document that would allow her to help me manage my financial affairs during the legal proceedings. She explained that having a family member with business experience handle my money would look better to the court than having me struggle with these matters alone. The document looked official, and Catherine assured me that it was just a formality to help protect my interests. In my vulnerable state, I trusted my sister completely and signed the papers without having Amanda review them first, which was a mistake that would cost me dearly. Within days of signing those papers, I began to notice that Catherine was asking very specific questions about Amanda's legal strategy and the evidence we had gathered against David. She wanted to know exactly when we planned to file certain motions, what witnesses we intended to call, and how we planned to prove that David's will was fraudulent. At first, I thought she was just being thorough in her support for me, but something about her questions began to feel wrong. When I mentioned this concern to Amanda, my attorney immediately became suspicious and warned me to be more careful about what information I shared with anyone, even family members. My worst fears were confirmed when I accidentally overheard a phone conversation that Catherine was having in the motel parking lot. I had returned from dinner earlier than expected and was walking toward my room when I heard Catherine's voice coming from behind a parked car. She was speaking quietly into her phone, but her words hit me like a physical blow. "I've got the signed power of attorney like you wanted," she was saying. "She trusts me completely and tells me everything about their legal strategy. The lawyer is smarter than we expected, but I'm getting you all the information you need to stay ahead of them." I stood frozen behind another car, listening as my own sister betrayed me to the son who had already tried to destroy my life. Catherine continued the conversation, saying, "The $50,000 better be in my account by tomorrow like you promised, David. I'm taking a huge risk helping you like this." She went on to detail exactly what Amanda and I were planning for the next phase of our legal case, giving David advance warning about every move we were going to make. When Catherine said, "Don't worry, she has no idea what's really happening," I felt my heart break all over again. After Catherine ended her call and went back to her own motel room, I sat in my car crying until there were no more tears left. My husband was dead, my son had tried to rob me and leave me homeless, and now my sister had sold me out for money. I felt completely alone in the world, surrounded by people who were supposed to love me but who were willing to destroy me for their own benefit. The family I had devoted my life to supporting and protecting had turned against me completely, leaving me with no one to trust except the lawyer I was paying to represent me. The next morning, I confronted Catherine about what I had overheard. Instead of showing any remorse or shame, she looked me straight in the eye and defended her actions. "Margaret, you're fighting a battle you can't win," she said coldly. "David has more money, better lawyers, and more influence than you'll ever have. I'm just being practical and choosing the winning side. You should do the same thing before you lose everything and end up with nothing." When I asked her how she could betray her own sister for money, Catherine shrugged and said, $50,000 is more than I make in a year. Family loyalty doesn't pay the bills." I immediately called Amanda to tell her about Catherine's betrayal and the fact that David now knew everything about our legal strategy. Amanda was furious and explained that the power of attorney I had signed could potentially be used to freeze my access to any funds we might recover, giving David another weapon to use against me in court. She filed an emergency motion to revoke the power of attorney, but warned me that David's advance knowledge of our legal plans would make our job much more difficult. We would have to completely change our strategy and assume that everything we did would be known to the other side immediately. That afternoon, I received a call from Harrison Clark at the bank informing me that my access to Robert's account had been temporarily suspended pending resolution of the power of attorney issue. David had used Catherine's document to claim that I was mentally incompetent to handle financial matters and needed a guardian to protect my interests. Even though the power of attorney was fraudulent, it would take weeks to get it overturned, during which time I would have no access to the money that was rightfully mine. I was trapped in a legal nightmare with no way to pay for my own defense except by borrowing against the outcome of a case that seemed to be slipping away from me despite the evidence on my side. Amanda called an emergency meeting at her office the next morning to discuss how we would respond to David's escalating attacks and the information leak from Catherine. She had spent all night researching David's legal team and their tactics, looking for any weakness we could exploit to turn the tables in our favor. Amanda's investigator Thomas Baker had also been working around the clock, following the money trail of David's payments to various people involved in this conspiracy. What they discovered gave us the ammunition we needed to fight back effectively against my son's seemingly superior resources and legal maneuvering. Thomas had uncovered evidence that David had bribed Judge William Foster, the probate court judge originally assigned to our case, with payments totaling $75,000 made through a series of intermediary accounts. David had also paid for Judge Foster's expensive vacation to the Bahamas last month, disguising the payment as a consulting fee from a shell company that David had created specifically for this purpose. This level of corruption went far beyond simple inheritance fraud and moved into the realm of serious federal crimes that could send David to prison for years. Even more damaging was a recording that Thomas had obtained of a conversation between David and Bradley Coleman discussing their plans to destroy my credibility and steal my inheritance. The recording revealed that David had specifically instructed Bradley to create a fake will that would exclude me completely, and that they had discussed hiring someone to make me appear mentally unstable. David's voice was clearly audible saying, "I don't care what it takes or how much it costs. I want my mother destroyed completely so she can never challenge me again." Amanda contacted FBI agent Sarah Chen, who specialized in public corruption cases, and provided her with all the evidence we had gathered about David's bribery of Judge Foster. Agent Chen was immediately interested in the case because judicial corruption was a high priority for federal law enforcement. She explained that if we could prove David had bribed a federal judge, he would face charges that could result in decades in prison. Agent Chen began her own investigation while we continued building our civil case in probate court. Amanda and I developed a strategic plan to turn David's overconfidence against him. We would let him think he was winning while secretly building an airtight case that would destroy him completely when we revealed our evidence. I would play the role of a defeated and broken woman while actually gathering more proof of his crimes with the FBI's help. This meant enduring more humiliation and attacks from my son, but I was determined to see justice done no matter how much it cost me personally. The plan began to unfold when David decided to throw a victory party at my former house, inviting neighbors and friends to celebrate what he claimed was his legal vindication. He even contacted local news reporters, boasting about how he had protected his inheritance from his supposedly greedy and mentally unstable mother. David's arrogance was so complete that he couldn't imagine any scenario where his carefully constructed fraud might be exposed. He had paid off the right people, destroyed my credibility, and isolated me from my family support system, so victory seemed inevitable to him. On the night of David's party, I appeared at the front door of my former home with Amanda and 2 other lawyers from her firm. The house was full of people drinking champagne and congratulating David on his legal success against me. When I walked into the living room where I had spent 25 years of my life, conversations stopped and people stared at me with a mixture of pity and contempt. David was holding court in the center of the room, telling everyone how he had been forced to take strong action against a mother who had become unstable and dangerous after his father's death. David's expression changed from smug satisfaction to nervous confusion when he saw me standing there with my legal team. "Mother, you're not welcome here," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "This is my house now, and I want you to leave immediately." Instead of backing down, I stepped forward and addressed the room full of people who had once been my friends and neighbors. "I just wanted to thank everyone for coming to celebrate with David," I said calmly. "I'm sure you'll all be very interested to learn about the FBI investigation into judicial bribery that began this morning." The room went completely silent as people processed what I had just said. David's face turned pale and he began to stammer denials, but Amanda stepped forward and began reading from a document that detailed the evidence against David and his co-conspirators. She announced that federal agents would be arriving shortly to arrest several people connected to this case, and that anyone who had unknowingly participated in David's celebration of criminal activity should consider leaving immediately to avoid being associated with the scandal. Catherine was also at the party, and when she realized that her betrayal had been discovered and documented, she began to panic visibly. She tried to approach me to explain herself, but Frank Miller stepped between us and made it clear that I had no interest in hearing anything she had to say. The party guests began leaving quickly, not wanting to be present when federal agents arrived to make arrests. David stood alone in the middle of the room that had once been my living room, finally understanding that his carefully constructed plan was falling apart completely. As the last guests hurried out the door, I looked directly at David and spoke the words I had been planning for weeks. Son, you thought you could destroy your own mother and get away with it because you had money and connections. What you didn't count on was the fact that truth and justice are more powerful than corruption and greed. Your father would be ashamed of what you've become, and after tonight, you'll have plenty of time in federal prison to think about the choices you've made. The first day of our court hearing arrived 3 weeks later, with David appearing confident alongside his expensive legal team led by Charles Whitman. David had hired expert witnesses, character references, and even a psychologist who was prepared to testify about my supposed mental instability based solely on reports from people who had been paid to lie about me. Bradley Coleman sat at the defense table wearing a nervous expression that suggested he knew their fraud was about to be exposed, but David seemed to believe that his money and influence would still carry the day in court. Judge Elizabeth Warren had been assigned to replace Judge Foster after his sudden resignation amid corruption allegations, and she had a reputation for being absolutely incorrigible with anyone who tried to manipulate her courtroom. Judge Warren was a stern woman in her 60s who had spent her entire career fighting for justice and had no patience for the kind of legal games that David's team was planning to play. She listened carefully as Amanda presented our opening arguments and the evidence we had gathered to prove that David had forged Robert's will and attempted to steal my rightful inheritance. Amanda's presentation was methodical and devastating, starting with the discovery of Robert's real will in the safety deposit box and building toward the evidence of bribery and corruption that David had used to try to steal my money. She called Drive Michael Torres, a forensic handwriting expert, who testified that the signatures on David's fraudulent will were clearly forged using samples of Robert's handwriting from other documents. Dr. Torres explained in detail how the forger had attempted to recreate Robert's signature but had failed to match the natural pressure variations and pen movements that characterized my husband's actual writing. The courtroom atmosphere changed dramatically when FBI agent Sarah Chen took the witness stand to testify about the federal investigation into judicial corruption. Agent Chen presented recordings of conversations between David and Judge Foster discussing the bribe payments, as well as bank records showing the exact amounts and dates of money transfers. She testified that David had paid Judge Foster a total of $125,000 over a period of 6 months, with the final payment being made just 2 days before Robert's fake will was scheduled to be validated in probate court. Bradley Coleman's composure finally cracked completely when Agent Chen announced that he was under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud and obstruction of justice. As federal marshals approached his table with handcuffs, Bradley began shouting that he had only been following David's orders and that he had evidence proving David was the mastermind behind everything. Judge Warren ordered the courtroom cleared of spectators while Bradley was formally arrested, but his desperate confession could be heard echoing through the halls as he was led away in custody. David tried to maintain his innocence even as the evidence mounted against him, claiming that he had been manipulated by Bradley Coleman and had no knowledge of any criminal activity. His lawyers attempted to portray him as a naive young man who had been taken advantage of by unscrupulous legal counsel, but this defense fell apart when Agent Chen presented the recordings of David's own voice giving explicit instructions about bribing the judge and forging his father's will. The recording of David saying, "I want my mother destroyed completely," was particularly damning, showing his calculated cruelty toward the woman who had raised him. Catherine was called as a witness and forced to testify about her role in betraying confidential information about my legal strategy. Under oath, she had no choice but to admit that David had paid her $50,000 in exchange for details about Amanda's plans and evidence. Catherine tried to minimize her role by claiming she had been pressured into helping David, but the evidence showed that she had actively sought him out to offer her services as a spy. Judge Warren was clearly disgusted by Catherine's betrayal of her own sister and made several sharp comments about family loyalty and moral character during her testimony. The tide turned completely in our favor when Dr. Patricia Morgan, the psychiatrist who had written the fake report about my mental health, was arrested during the lunch recess on charges of creating fraudulent medical documents. Under questioning by federal agents, Dr. Morgan admitted that David had paid her $10,000 to write a psychological evaluation of someone she had never met or examined. This confession destroyed any remaining credibility of David's claims about my supposed mental instability and showed the depth of his conspiracy to defame and destroy me. Judge Warren announced her decision at the end of the 3-day hearing, and her words were everything I had hoped for during months of legal battles. The evidence in this case reveals a shocking pattern of fraud, bribery, and family betrayal that strikes at the very heart of our legal system, she said firmly. David Thompson has been found guilty of forging legal documents, bribing a public official, and conspiracy to commit theft. The fake will presented by Mr. Thompson is hereby declared null and void, and Robert Thompson's actual will is validated as his true final testament. David was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for his crimes, with no possibility of parole for the first 5 years. His expensive lawyers could do nothing to save him from the consequences of his actions, and I watched with mixed emotions as my son was led away in handcuffs. Catherine received a suspended sentence of 2 years in prison but was ordered to pay me $100,000 in restitution for the damage her betrayal had caused to my legal case. Justice had been served, but the cost in terms of family relationships was devastating and permanent. Even though we had won the criminal case against David, the civil proceedings to actually recover my inheritance proved to be another battle entirely. David's criminal conviction had been appealed by his new legal team, creating complications that delayed my access to Robert's $33 million account for several more months. The appeals process meant that the money remained frozen while higher courts reviewed the case, leaving me still living in modest circumstances despite technically being a multimillionaire. Amanda warned me that this was a common tactic used to pressure inheritance dispute winners into accepting smaller settlements rather than waiting for full legal resolution. The situation became dangerous again when Victor Sanchez, the private investigator who had been harassing me throughout the legal proceedings, decided to take matters into his own hands. Victor had been paid a substantial sum by David to destroy my credibility, and with David now in prison, Victor was worried about being prosecuted for his role in the conspiracy. He hired 2 men from his criminal contacts to intimidate me into dropping all charges and disappearing quietly from Cleveland. These men began following me everywhere I went, making threatening gestures and leaving dead flowers at my motel room door as a warning. The harassment escalated when Frank Miller, my security guard, was attacked in the motel parking lot by Victor's associates. Frank fought them off but suffered a broken arm and several bruises that required medical attention. This attack crossed a line from legal intimidation into physical violence, and I realized that Victor was becoming increasingly desperate as the walls closed in around him. Amanda immediately contacted Agent Sarah Chen, who assured us that Victor was already under federal investigation for his role in David's conspiracy and that his recent actions would only add to his eventual prison sentence. I decided that I had endured enough threats and intimidation from people who thought they could destroy me with violence and fear. Instead of backing down, I hired Detective James Wilson, a former FBI agent who specialized in investigating private detectives who crossed legal boundaries. James had years of experience dealing with criminals who tried to use intimidation tactics against witnesses and victims, and he knew exactly how to gather evidence that would put Victor behind bars permanently. James's investigation revealed that Victor had a history of using illegal surveillance methods, planting evidence, and threatening witnesses in other cases throughout his career. Victor had been operating on the edge of legality for years, protected by clients with enough money to cover up his crimes, but David's prosecution had exposed him to scrutiny that revealed his pattern of criminal behavior. James gathered testimony from several of Victor's former victims who were willing to testify about his threats and illegal activities once they learned he was finally being held accountable. Within 2 weeks, Victor Sanchez was arrested on federal charges of witness intimidation, conspiracy, and assault. The 2 men he had hired to threaten me were also arrested and agreed to testify against him in exchange for reduced sentences. Victor's arrest eliminated the last major threat to my safety, but it also revealed how far the conspiracy against me had extended beyond just David and Bradley Coleman. There had been a whole network of corrupt people working together to steal my inheritance and destroy my life, all motivated by greed and enabled by David's willingness to pay for any service that would help him achieve his goals. Dr. Patricia Morgan, the psychiatrist who had created fake medical records about me, was also facing additional charges after investigators discovered that she had falsified psychological evaluations for other clients who wanted to have family members declared mentally incompetent. Her medical license was revoked permanently, and she was sentenced to 3 years in prison for fraud and conspiracy. The systematic nature of her fraud showed that David had hired someone with experience in helping families steal inheritances through false claims of mental illness. The appeals court finally upheld David's conviction and Judge Warren's ruling about Robert's will, clearing the way for me to access my husband's $33 million account. Amanda filed the necessary paperwork with First National Bank, and Harrison Clark personally handled the process of transferring the funds into accounts that I could control. After nearly 8 months of legal battles, threats, and family betrayal, I was finally able to claim what Robert had intended for me to inherit as his widow and life partner. The final obstacle came when David's appeal lawyers attempted to file one last motion claiming that I had used undue influence to convince Robert to leave me his money. This desperate argument fell apart immediately when Amanda presented evidence of Robert's investment history showing that he had been building this account for 15 years, long before any supposed influence could have taken place. Judge Warren dismissed this final appeal with harsh words about frivolous legal tactics designed to delay justice, and my inheritance was finally secured beyond any possible challenge. The day I finally gained full access to Robert's $33 million was both triumphant and bittersweet, representing not just financial victory but also the end of a nightmare that had cost me my relationship with my son and sister. Harrison Clark personally handled the paperwork at First National Bank, apologizing profusely for the months of delays and complications that had kept me from accessing money that should have been available immediately after Robert's death. The bank's lawyers had advised them to be extremely cautious during the legal proceedings, but Harrison admitted that they could have handled the situation with more sensitivity to my difficult circumstances. My first priority was using Robert's money in ways that would honor his memory and help other people who found themselves in situations similar to mine. I established the Margaret Thompson Foundation for Family Justice, a charitable organization dedicated to helping women who had been betrayed or abandoned by their families during inheritance disputes. Too many women found themselves homeless and penniless after losing their husbands because family members stole their rightful inheritance or manipulated legal systems to their advantage. The foundation would provide legal assistance, temporary housing, and emotional support to help these women fight for what belonged to them. I decided to buy back my family home from the court-ordered auction that had been scheduled to pay David's legal debts and criminal fines. The house held 25 years of happy memories with Robert, and I couldn't bear the thought of strangers living in the place where we had built our life together. When I walked through the front door for the first time since David had thrown me out, I felt Robert's presence in every room and knew that he would have approved of my decision to reclaim our sanctuary. The house needed some repairs after months of neglect, but restoring it to its former condition became a therapeutic project that helped me heal from the trauma of the past year. 3 months after David was sentenced to prison, I received a letter from him asking for my forgiveness and claiming that he had finally realized the magnitude of his crimes against me. David wrote that prison had given him time to think about his actions and that he was ashamed of how he had treated the mother who had loved and supported him throughout his life. He asked if I would consider visiting him so he could apologize in person and try to rebuild some kind of relationship with me. Reading his letter brought back all the pain of his betrayal, but also reminded me of the sweet child he had once been before greed and entitlement corrupted his character. I was not ready to forgive David or visit him in prison, but I wrote back telling him that I hoped his time incarcerated would help him become a better person who was capable of genuine remorse and change. I explained that forgiveness would have to be earned through consistent good behavior and proof that he had truly changed his values and priorities. David would have to serve his sentence and demonstrate real growth before I could consider having any kind of relationship with him again. The door was not closed forever, but it would remain locked until he proved himself worthy of trust. Catherine's situation was more complicated because she had been released on probation and was genuinely trying to make amends for her betrayal. She had lost her marketing job because of her criminal conviction and was working as a waitress while trying to pay back the restitution money she owed me. Catherine called several times asking to meet with me so she could apologize and explain her actions, but I was not ready for that conversation either. The Foundation's lawyer advised me that any contact with Catherine should be carefully documented in case her probation officer needed information about her compliance with court orders. Eventually, Catherine showed up at the Foundation's office asking to volunteer her marketing skills to help with our fundraising efforts. She said that working for the organization would be a way for her to try to repair some of the damage she had caused while also using her professional experience to help other women in similar situations. After discussing the situation with Amanda and the Foundation's board of directors, I decided to give Catherine a chance to prove that her remorse was genuine by allowing her to work as an unpaid volunteer under strict supervision. Frank Miller accepted my offer to become the head of security for the Robert Thompson Foundation, protecting both the organization's facilities and the women we served from the kind of intimidation tactics that had been used against me. Frank's experience with personal protection and his understanding of how family disputes could turn violent made him the perfect person to ensure that our clients felt safe while pursuing their legal rights. His presence at the foundation also gave me personal comfort, knowing that someone I trusted was always nearby in case any new threats emerged. Amanda Rodriguez became not just my attorney but also one of my closest friends and the Foundation's legal director. Her expertise in inheritance disputes and family law made her invaluable in developing the Foundation's programs and services. Amanda's passion for justice aligned perfectly with the Foundation's mission, and she reduced her private practice to focus more time on helping women who couldn't afford high-quality legal representation. Working together on the Foundation gave us both a sense of purpose that went beyond winning individual cases to creating systematic change in how inheritance disputes were handled. Harrison Clark from First National Bank became my personal financial advisor, helping me invest and manage the $33 million in ways that would generate income for both my personal needs and the Foundation's operations. Harrison felt personally responsible for the delays I had experienced in accessing my inheritance and was determined to ensure that my money was handled with the expertise and care that Robert would have expected. His conservative investment strategy focused on steady growth and capital preservation, allowing me to live comfortably while ensuring that the Foundation would have resources to help women for generations to come. The Foundation's first year was incredibly successful, helping more than 200 women navigate inheritance disputes, family betrayals, and legal challenges that threatened to leave them homeless and destitute. Many of these women had stories remarkably similar to mine, involving family members who used forged documents, false accusations of mental illness, or simple intimidation to steal money that belonged to their victims. Seeing how common these situations were made me realize that my experience with David, while personally devastating, was part of a much larger pattern of family financial abuse that needed to be addressed systematically. I also found unexpected personal happiness when I met George Mitchell, a 58-year-old widower who had been volunteering at the Foundation's financial literacy workshops. George had lost his wife to cancer 2 years earlier and was using his background as a retired accountant to help women understand their financial rights and options. He was a gentle, kind man with silver hair and warm brown eyes who understood the pain of losing a life partner and starting over in middle age. Our friendship developed slowly and naturally, based on shared values and mutual respect rather than physical attraction or loneliness. 1 year after winning my legal battle against David and Catherine, I found myself sitting in the sunroom of my restored family home, reflecting on an incredible journey that had transformed me from a broken widow into a strong advocate for family justice. The Robert Thompson Foundation had grown beyond my wildest expectations, with satellite offices in 3 other cities and plans to expand our services nationally. What started as my personal quest for justice had become a movement helping thousands of women who had been betrayed by the people they should have been able to trust most completely. The foundation's success brought unexpected recognition and opportunities to speak at legal conferences, women's organizations, and universities about family financial abuse and inheritance fraud. Sharing my story publicly was difficult at first because it required me to relive painful memories of betrayal and loss, but seeing how my experience inspired other women to fight for their rights made every speaking engagement worthwhile. Many audience members approached me afterward with their own stories of family betrayal, and several became foundation clients who successfully recovered stolen inheritances with our help. George Mitchell and I had been dating for 6 months when he proposed marriage during a quiet dinner at our favorite restaurant overlooking Lake Erie. His proposal was simple and sincere, acknowledging that we were both bringing grief and loss from our previous marriages but also offering hope for new happiness together. George understood that I would always love Robert and that my foundation work honoring his memory would remain a central part of my life. His willingness to support my mission rather than compete with it convinced me that marrying him would enhance rather than diminish the life I had rebuilt after losing everything. Our wedding was a small ceremony held in the garden behind my family home, with Amanda serving as maid of honor and Frank Miller giving me away since I no longer had family members who could fulfill that traditional role. The foundation's staff and volunteers attended along with a few close friends, creating an intimate celebration that focused on love and commitment rather than elaborate display. George's adult children from his first marriage welcomed me warmly into their family, understanding that their father deserved happiness again after years of grieving their mother's death. David was released from federal prison after serving 7 years of his 10-year sentence, earning early release for good behavior and participation in educational programs. He wrote to ask if he could visit me to make amends in person, but I was not ready for that step in our relationship. Instead, I wrote back suggesting that he demonstrate his rehabilitation by volunteering with organizations that helped formerly incarcerated people rebuild their lives. If David could show consistent commitment to helping others and living honestly, perhaps we could eventually have some kind of limited relationship, but trust would have to be earned gradually over many years. Catherine had completed her probation successfully and had been working at the foundation for over a year, proving herself to be genuinely committed to making amends for her betrayal. Her marketing expertise had been invaluable in expanding our reach and developing new programs, and she had never asked for anything beyond the opportunity to try to repair the damage she had caused. While I could not forget what Catherine had done, I was beginning to forgive her because her actions consistently demonstrated real remorse and change. Our relationship would never be the same as before her betrayal, but it was evolving into something based on mutual respect rather than blind trust. The most profound lesson I learned from this entire experience was that adversity can reveal not only the worst in people but also strength and resilience that you never knew you possessed. The woman who stood crying outside her own home with a single suitcase had discovered reserves of courage, determination, and wisdom that enabled her to fight against seemingly impossible odds and emerge victorious. Losing everything forced me to discover who I really was beneath the roles of wife and mother, and that discovery was ultimately liberating despite the enormous pain involved. I also learned that money, while important for security and comfort, was not the real treasure that Robert had left me. His true gift was the example he set of working hard, saving carefully, and planning for the future with love and responsibility. The $33 million he accumulated was less important than the values and work ethic that enabled him to build that wealth over 15 years of patient investment. Teaching other women to claim not just their financial inheritance but also their right to dignity and respect became the most meaningful work of my life. Perhaps the most surprising lesson was discovering that justice is not something that happens automatically but rather something that must be fought for with intelligence, persistence, and courage. David's initial success in stealing my inheritance was possible because he counted on my ignorance of legal procedures and my reluctance to fight against my own family. Evil often triumphs when good people are too shocked or overwhelmed to take effective action. But the legal system can work for justice when victims are willing to gather evidence, hire competent help, and persevere through long and difficult battles. The Foundation's work showed me that my experience was not unique but rather part of a widespread pattern of family financial abuse that disproportionately affects older women who have devoted their lives to supporting their families. Too many women find themselves vulnerable after losing their husbands because they trusted family members to treat them fairly and did not protect themselves legally or financially. Our programs teaching women to understand their legal rights and document their financial contributions to family wealth were preventing countless tragedies similar to what happened to me. Now, as I write this story from my home office overlooking the garden where George and I were married, I can honestly say that I am happier and more fulfilled than I ever imagined possible during those dark days at the Sunset Motel. The betrayals that nearly destroyed me ultimately led to discoveries about my own strength and purpose that transformed my life in ways that would not have been possible without experiencing that devastating loss and fighting to recover from it completely. Sometimes the greatest losses lead to the most important discoveries about who we really are and what we are capable of achieving when we refuse to accept injustice or surrender to despair. I lost a family through betrayal but found myself and my true purpose through the struggle to reclaim what was rightfully mine. The $33 million was just money, but the strength, wisdom, and sense of mission I discovered during that fight were treasures beyond any monetary value. What's your biggest takeaway from Margaret's incredible journey from betrayal to triumph? Have you ever had to fight against family members who tried to take advantage of you during difficult times? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below because your story might inspire someone else who's facing similar challenges. If Margaret's courage to fight for justice despite overwhelming odds moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more real-life stories of people who refused to let family betrayal destroy their lives. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who might be struggling with inheritance disputes or family financial abuse, because knowledge truly is power when it comes to protecting yourself from people who would steal your future. Thank you for joining Margaret on this emotional journey, and remember that no matter how dark things seem, there is always hope for justice and new beginnings when you have the courage to fight for what's right.